Okay. All right. We've got our proper warning. Um, okay. So there should be a verse on the screen right now. Um, and what we'd like to look at this morning are three key prophecies that help identify the Messiah. Now, the word Messiah is just talking about a special one that was to come, that was identified early in the scriptures and is mentioned throughout the Hebrew scriptures, that is the Old Testament. So, at various times in the Old Testament, there will be a mention that one is coming, a special one. This would be the Messiah, a special one who's going to be the Savior, the Deliverer, the coming King, and so on. All of these things talked about this special one. So people who were uh, readers of and followers of the Old Testament would have been living their life in anticipation that there would be this special one coming, this Messiah coming. Now, when Jesus came, and he was the one that was being talked about, some of the Jews, in fact, many of the Jews, rejected him. And after he died and rose again and went to heaven, a man named Apollos in the book of Acts uh, used the Old Testament scriptures. And it says in this verse in Acts 18:28, he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the scriptures that Jesus is this special one, the Christ, the Messiah. So I don't know, and none of us knows what his content was. We don't know which scriptures he turned to, but we do know from this that it is possible to use the Old Testament scriptures to show that Jesus, in fact, is that special one, that Messiah. So, not knowing the scriptures he used, I kind of wonder if he used any of these. But I'd like to look at three prophecies spoken of about who the Messiah would be and show that it was, in fact, Jesus. So, back in the Old Testament, even as early as Genesis 3, we get some prophecies about this special one coming. And I'll claim that these three prophecies we're going to look at narrow down the list of qualified people from billions of people who have ever walked the earth down to about 100 or even fewer than that. And then that's just three. I mean, there are more than three, so that would narrow down the list even more to an astonishingly small probability that anybody could have fulfilled all of these. But Jesus did. Okay, the first one has to do with the timing. When will Messiah come? And for this one, we have a kind of famous prophecy in Daniel that talks about the time of his coming. Now, I have his birth. It may be referring to just before his death or somewhere in that generation. So, when will Messiah come? Well, Daniel gives us some indication that of timing. So he writes this, and I've quoted this from a translation of the Bible that uses the word sevens instead of the word weeks, because that's literally what it is. So it says this: now listen and understand. 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem until a ruler, the anointed one, and that's the Messiah, is what's written there, comes. Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses, despite the perilous times. I think that's the first set of 7. After this period of 62 sets of 7, the anointed one, that is Messiah, would be killed. Now, most Bibles where it says anointed one actually read Messiah. So it's a trade-off. I like the word Messiah in the other ones, but I like the way it talks about the sets of 7 in this one, in this translation. But they're all really saying the same thing. That it would be 483 years between this command to rebuild Jerusalem till the coming of Messiah. So we have, that's basically 69 times 7, you get 483. Now, what's interesting is that the word years doesn't appear. Um, and I say it's 483 years. Now, one might argue, well, maybe it was days. You could, that's fine. In which case, the Messiah would come either in 483 days or in 483 years. So since he didn't come in 483 days, you're left with years. So that's fine. But I will note this, that even Jews who vigorously argue against this and say, no, 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 it wasn't talking about Jesus. We think it. We think there was some rabbi friend of ours that we have that lived way back then that was killed. We think it might be talking about him, which is kind of a silly argument. But be that as it may, even they say that the years is correct. So this idea that maybe Christians come along and just say, well, we think this must mean years and not days or something like that. Um, Even the skeptics who try to argue against say, no, 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 the years is clear. That's what it's talking about. So we take it that way and make an intriguing calculation because historically people have identified 445 BC as the time of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem given by Artaxerxes. And that would then take you how far into the future? Well, it does get a touch complicated because other parts of the Bible will tell us, like Revelation, for instance, that the years in prophecy are 360 days. This goes according to ancient calendars like Babylonian calendars and so on. And it actually turns out to be why we have 360 degrees in a circle today, uh, going back to that tradition. Now, the reason 360 degrees in a circle has actually remained until today is because 360 is divisible by lots of things, and it turns out to be very convenient for us. But if we take this idea, like in Revelation and so on, where a prophetic year is 360 days, well, then we have to say, well, how many of our normal years was that? So you do a little calculation like this. Don't worry about the math. This is going to go from BC to AD, and we add a year to this calculation since there's no year zero, and we come up with AD 32, which is, according to some measures, some people are off by a year, so on, but according to some measures, the year that Christ died. So somebody got really into detail on this named Sir Robert Anderson, and he calculated it down to the day that Christ officially entered Jerusalem leading up to his death. Now, do I buy into all of this? What you see on the screen? Do I buy into all this? Um, Maybe. Um, maybe in terms of getting it down to a day and all of this, but I'm not going to argue for it. What I am going to argue for is that, generally speaking, the generation in which Messiah would come has been identified. That's all I'm trying to argue for. So while I think it's very interesting that some people can flip the date this way and that way and look at it from this point of view and say this started on that date and this ended on that date, I do find all of that very interesting. But if I'm going to argue against a skeptic, I'm not going to try to say, oh, it's this exact date, because the skeptic could say, wait a minute, what if you do it the other way? What if you think of this date instead of that date, and so on? So I think it best not to try to get into the arguments of this date, this exact day, and so on, simply because the skeptic can then find areas to maybe try to argue against. But what is clear is that a generation of people is being identified, and it's the generation that Christ lived in, and that's the important thing. So the time has been identified, at least down to a generation. Forget for the moment the day or calculating, the prophetic year, the solar year, and so on. basically we have it coming down to a generation, and Christ did come in that generation. Jesus did come in that generation. So now we've narrowed down from billions of people possible to only the people within that generation. So we've done some good work so far in narrowing down Messiah. Next, besides time, is the place. Micah 5:2 reads, and these are all written hundreds of years before Christ came, by the way. So this is all ahead of time, and we can prove that. We even have scrolls that date back before the time of Christ that have all of these prophecies in them. So, all right, the place identified. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from everlasting. And the people of Christ's day did not have any problem understanding this. In fact, when it was asked about the time Christ was born, when it was asked, hey, you Jewish scholars, where is he supposed to be born? I mean, they all said, man, this is the easiest question in the world. And they just answered very quickly by quoting this. So he's going to be born in Bethlehem. We all know that. So this was how it was understood. And Christ was, in fact, born in Bethlehem. Now, I have to say about Christ being born in Bethlehem, if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if they were trying to fabricate that Jesus was the Messiah, if they were trying to make it up, if they were trying to cook the books, so to speak, what would they do? Let's say Jesus was just an ordinary man born in an ordinary place, and they wanted to make people think he was the Messiah. What would they do? Well, your answer would be they would surely write a story about him that he was born in Bethlehem, because you got to say he's been born in Bethlehem. Otherwise, nobody's going to take you seriously. Could that have been the case? Could the writers simply have said he was born in Bethlehem when he really wasn't? And for this, I'd like us to think about what Luke writes about Christ's birth in Bethlehem. If he were fabricating the story, what he would write is, well, they were traveling through Bethlehem and nobody saw it. Nobody saw them. They kind of, the baby came unexpectedly. They kind of were huddled down behind a dumpster somewhere, and the baby came and nobody saw it. And then they went on back to Nazareth. That's how you would write it if you were fabricating it, because nobody can disprove it. But Luke doesn't write that. Luke writes that this event was widely publicized, so much so it was miraculous that shepherds in their field would see the whole heaven opened up and this angelic host. I mean, this was a day they would never forget and never stop talking about. And they were visited by angels and saw this entire spectacular display in the sky, and then given the message to go and see them and see this child. So they went and they saw the babe lying in the manger and Mary and Joseph there and so on. They saw the whole thing. They witnessed the whole thing. They witnessed it in a way where it would be highly publicized. Everybody knew that this event happened. And if the shepherds were rather young at that time, even at the time of Luke's writing, they would still be alive. They could be interviewed. And for those that had passed away by that time, well, their kids would no doubt say, that's all that my dad used to talk about was that day. So this was a verifiable event. It was highly publicized. It was highly witnessed. And Luke writes it that way. So no, this was no fabrication that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. It was definitely verifiable. So we have the time down to a generation. We have the place down to Bethlehem. Now, what was the population of Bethlehem during that generation? Well, I don't know. Bethlehem was never known to be a huge place. It's only 60,000 even today. So you could imagine even 100 years ago, it was much smaller. So back in the time of Christ, I don't know. I'm going to be very generous and say it was a town of 10,000, but I think that that's probably too big. But now we have the place down anyway, and we have one generation, one place, maybe down to 10,000. The next prophecy then of the big three has to do with the throne. And in 2 Samuel 7, we read that the Lord tells David, regarding David, he says, "But my mercy shall not depart from him," that is David, "as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever." So Saul, King Saul, who came before David, was a bad king, and he wished that maybe his son would take the throne, and maybe his son after him, and his son after him, that there would be a many generations long dynasty coming from Saul. And God says, "Nope, I'm taking it from you. You don't get that." But to David, he says, "It is going to be true for you, David. You are going to have not only the throne yourself, but your son will take the throne, and his son will take the throne, and his son will take the throne. And this is going to happen until Messiah himself takes the throne." Now, this is corroborated by many other scriptures. So when it says, "Your throne shall be established forever," it means that one day Messiah would sit on that throne and he will reign forever. Now, if you don't see it there and you say, "Well, I don't see the word Messiah in that verse," that's fine. It turns out that there are a whole lot of other verses that say this. So much so that even in Matthew 22, when the Jews who did not believe in Jesus were talking about Messiah, they themselves said, "Well, Messiah has to be son of David," meaning of that lineage, of that royal line. And there are all of these other scriptures in the Old Testament that talk about this. Psalm 89 is very interesting because it says how certain this is. Psalm 89 even goes so far as to say, even if Israel turned away from God completely and turned bad and they did all kinds of wickedness, God says, even if that happened, nonetheless, I am still going to hold to that promise I made about David's royal line. So this is a promise that God had made. Now, we have the time, one generation. We have a place down, Bethlehem. Now we have a family down, and the graphics seem awfully weird in this picture. My apologies. But how many people in Bethlehem at that time might fulfill this? Now, typically we think when you have one generation following another generation, following another generation, we think that the number of descendants increases exponentially, right? I mean, if I have a few children and each of those children have a few children and each of those children have a few children, as you move along the generations, the number of people gets larger and larger and larger really fast. So you might think that this prophecy really doesn't narrow things down that much. But we're going to see that that's actually not the case. First of all, the royal line does not split into many, many, many different people because the royal line stays at a particular person. So what I mean is David's son was Solomon, who took the throne. Solomon's son was Rehoboam, who took the throne. Now, once you go down to Rehoboam, for instance, you don't get to take some other branch of David's line and say, well, this third cousin over here, he's also of David, he's going to get the throne next. The royal line, that is whose son's son going down in a line, it is a singular line. It is not one where you can get down 7 generations and then look across for a fourth cousin 3 times removed person to then take the throne. Occasionally a brother would or something like that, right, locally, but you don't get this idea where there's this branching to where many, many people could be available for the throne. So this singular line went on to about 800 BC, when all of the royal line, except a guy named Joash, was killed. So at 800 BC, you know that there was only one person available that the royal line could come through. And in fact, kings kept going on from that line till about 600 BC. So whether you want to take 800 BC when Joash lived, because he's definitely identified as the only one live who was qualified, or you more likely take it as 600 BC when the royal line stopped, when Jerusalem was taken over by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and there was no more king reigning on the throne. Babylon was now in control of everything. At that point, you now do have a possible branching out, because you don't have one singular line of kings to follow down. You now have various sons who could be king. So you now need to ask, at the time of Christ's birth, how big was the pool of people that would fulfill this royal line? Now, in order to think about it, I want you to think about a man living back at, say, 600 BC. That's going to be kind of in the middle of your screen right now. That's the M. Suppose this man had two children. One was a boy and one was a girl, and they grew up to be another man and woman. So now the second line after that one M, you have an M and a W. That's a man and a woman. Now suppose that each of those had two children. You now have four children, a man, a woman, a man, a woman. Now I'm just pretending that they both have a boy and a girl. In reality, one may have more children than two, one may have less children than two, one may have all boys, one may have all girls. I mean, just life is like that. So I'm just putting something up just to make a simple point. And the point is that when you get down to the time of Christ's birth, you may have many, many, many children that come from this one man that lived in 600 BC. But how many of those children were born through only male connections, which appears in scripture, particularly at the time of Joash, to be the requirement? So if you have these thousands of people down at the generation of Christ's birth that all trace their lineage back to this one man in 600 BC, how many of those trace their lineage only through male connections? Now, in the picture that I showed here, if everybody had one boy and one girl, which is unrealistic, but it's just to make the point, in this picture, there would be only one. Of the thousands on the bottom line, only one would trace his lineage all the way back to the man at the top of that pyramid. Only one would be able to trace it back only through male connections. Now, the point is that the royal line given is not one that explodes in terms of the number of people. So this idea that, yeah, you go down several generations, you go, you go maybe, 3 or 4 children this generation, they all have 3 or 4 children, they all have 3 or 4 children. Before you know it, you have thousands and thousands. That actually doesn't hold for the requirement of the royal line. On average, if you take the number of men at the time of Christ and divide it by the number of men back in 600 BC, on average, that's how many people each male will produce through only male connections down in that generation of Christ's birth. If what I said right now is confusing and you don't really piece it together very well, don't worry. So first of all, it's been well thought out and it's been kind of presented to other people good at math. So it's right. Don't worry about that. But my point is that if you're somebody, a guy living in 600 BC, and you're wondering on average how many of your descendants will be living 600 years later through only male connections, in other words, your son, etc. You could expect it to be kind of like 2 or something, not 2,000 or anything like that. And it sounds a little sad. What happens is, for most people, the number is 0. In other words, they might have a boy and a girl, and then one of those, the boy might have only girls. Well, If you're only counting male connections, well, that's the end of that line. So for most people, the number they produce down the line is 0. But those that are not 0 are not huge. I actually ran a computer simulation that did this. I'm a little nerdy. And I kind of, estimated different numbers of kids people could have. And of course, some people might not get married through their life, or they die young before they got married. And it accounted for a lot of these things, and it tried to make it realistic. And indeed, a lot of the numbers would produce 0 in that generation, and some would produce, 15 or 5 or 20 maybe. But the idea was not thousands. It does not blow up like that. It was very fascinating. I think that somebody who looked at this would easily argue that the number of qualified people would not be in the thousands. So the family, I'm going to be very generous and say that 100 people living in Bethlehem, born in Bethlehem, could trace their genealogy to that royal line through only male connections. That's very conservative. It's probably more like tens. Now, this is verifiable. And the reason it is because we have this genealogy given in the book of Matthew showing how Jesus, in fact, did come from that royal line. But this is verifiable in a sense that if Matthew tried to cook the books and just make it up, all of the close relatives of that family of Mary and Joseph, that the close relatives would also have their genealogies. And a lot of the relatives didn't even believe on Jesus. They were they were against him, some of them. And you have to now then assume that all of the people around who were able to be found, people didn't move around like they do today. They were able to be found, and you could see if one person cooked their books and changed it and had these erasure marks and tried, no, it really, my genealogy really went like this. Well, you could ask his first cousin if they also have that genealogy, and so on. It's verifiable. It's disprovable. Matthew could not have gotten away with just cooking the books with all of the people who were out viciously to discredit him. It would have been easy to discredit him if he had cooked the books. So now we've got it down to a handful. Now, from this handful, how many of those even claimed to be Messiah? Most of those, if you ask them, they say, no, I'm just a normal guy, leave me alone. So of those, how many even claim to be Messiah? You're down probably to Jesus alone at that point. But that represents just 3 prophecies. Add to that many, many more, and the probability that anybody could match everything the way Jesus did is just astonishing. And of course, this was written before Christ came. Now, my friend that I talked about that I was with just last week, Jim McCarthy, he wrote a tract on Isaiah 53, and we haven't even touched that in our prophecies this morning. And he identifies in that one chapter 12 things described about one coming. And he claims that just with these 12, there's only one person in human history who has fulfilled all of these. And a lot of these had to do with his time on the cross. So it's just fascinating, the things written hundreds of years before Christ came that single out only one person as being the true Messiah. So with that, let me stop sharing, and I'll go to